what is actually their priority or what's their motives? And all these questions, next time I will appreciate them more.
Our featured speaker today is the founder and CEO of Starlix, ESI committee member of SF1 Sustainable Finance, and made the Women in Fintech Power list 3 years in a row. Chryssi, it is a great pleasure to have you as our featured guest today, and we've spoken to you before. But thank you again so much for being willing to talk to us and share your journey.
Oh, thank you, Spencer, and thank you, Matt, for having me. And I thank Nancy also for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. So I'll give some intro about myself, and then we can kick off a discussion, and you can ask some questions as well about the journey.
Thank you. That sounds great.
So yes, I'm an engineer. I studied the civil engineering, and in my early 20s, I wanted to figure out more about how the financial system works. Just because it was of interest to understand how the capital and how the money flows within the system. I started off working at the FCA, which is the UK regulator, and asking multiple questions of why and how and what. I moved on to working for a bank, and then thereafter for a fintech, and there was a logic behind these movements, understanding more how banks risk manage, understanding how the regulators regulate financial services, understanding what type of technologies banks and other financial institutions use to manage and to operate their businesses. And a few years ago, Spencer, I joined and I did the MIT bootcamp at Seoul, which gave me a twist on my journey, and I decided to become an entrepreneur. So initially, I joined an early stage company, which was developing AI models using AI machine learning to identify financial vulnerability, which gave me a great insight more into financial inclusion and understanding different people's journeys and abilities. And then I moved on, focusing on to my own company, which was about solving the problems of cross-border payments. And yes, so this has been a journey of nearly 20 years. So I'm now going to move on to the journey of Starlix, why I created Starlix, and how it became about. So Starlix, I joined in between my entrepreneurial journey. Just before I kick it off, I was consulting a payment institution. They were sending money mainly to Nigeria, so to emerging markets, but mainly to Nigeria. A few other corridors were India, Brazil, Ghana, and amongst others. And they were part of a community, an association of other remittance money transfer companies that were sending money to emerging markets, South America, Southeast Asia, and Africa. Now, the issues they were encountering was that due to some regulations after the 2008 crisis, which kicked in, the US made their regulations a bit more strict, which that passed down the road of the financial institutions, correspondent banks down to national banks. And the outcome of that was that many of these remittance companies were losing their bank accounts. So they were debanked or otherwise de-risked by the financial institutions. And you can imagine so that when these money remittances lose their bank accounts, they can't send money to developing countries. And the persona of these money remittance companies were mainly community-based. So the founder would be Indian, or the founder would be Nigerian, or the founder would be Nepalese, and they would cater for their Indian or Nigerian or Nepalese community. These are just a few examples. There are several other countries included. So I wanted in my career to focus more on a meaningful work. I thought financial services can become meaningful if you try to help different communities that are unsupported relative to others. And these could be, for example, communities such as from the developing countries, migrants into the UK or into the Western world. So I thought this was a good use case, and I was happy to consult this company and examine what type of solutions existed in the industry at that time. So I did an overview of seeing which type of companies existed. A few of them were like Ripple or Stellar. It was quite prominent at that time. It was around the 2017-2018 mark. Blockchain, as well as the rise of crypto and Bitcoin for the use of cross-border flows and remittances. So I looked into which of these channels could be used as an alternative to the US dollar, because the US dollar, as I mentioned earlier, was regulated. So these were the type of projects and that I was examining, and throughout this came some conclusions. I did educate that industry about the new technologies, which was distributed ledger and blockchain, which I found interesting, but there is always also some risk associated. So one had to understand the opportunities and the benefits and risks associated with these type of technologies and these alternative forms of money transfer, like as I mentioned, Bitcoin and a few others. We came together with this payment institution and some of other payment institutions within this association, and we decided to do some workshops. And collectively we designed a solution. Also, I got inspired of an existing project out there on how we could actually help, how these payment institutions, these remittance companies could actually get on a platform, on a common ledger, and therefore transact between themselves without really needing to use the US dollar or the correspondent banking industry parties. We designed I gathered the business requirements and also the challenges and the thought process of these institutions, and then I went and I designed a possible solution which I presented, and this formed the basis of a proof of concept, which we did with a company which was using a distributed ledger. And throughout this journey, we were I was like researching more the type of ledgers. So there is sometimes a confusion between blockchain and distributed ledger, because there are different forms of the distributed ledger. Sometimes it's not really necessary to use this type of technology, so one has to understand really well the problem statement and the use case, and as well examine the different legal and regulatory requirements. So moving from blockchain and that world, it narrowed down onto actually a centralized ledger, because we figured out that compliance is necessary. So whereas at the beginning I was focusing completely on cross-border payments and alternative means of sending money, then I was actually including into the design other elements, just like how these payment institutions are compliant, or what's their standards of documentation, or how do they understand their customers. So that was an interesting journey, and I figured out that when especially in financial services, there's so many type of stakeholders involved and actors that you in the beginning you have a more narrow point of view and you're focusing on the problem, but then you have to understand the dynamics and which other actors have to be part of the picture, because otherwise your picture and your solution is incomplete. Are there any questions? And please stop me if I'm becoming too technical.
I think I'm keeping up with everything, but just so I sort of understand the process, just like to simplify it a little bit. You basically saw this, that there were issues in regards to this new regulation no longer allowing certain cross-border payments. You then went and had discussions with a lot of these remittance companies, then saw from that discussion and from the connection, saw this opportunity there and jumped in to create in that space. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so effectively payments to, for example, to South Africa, to Africa was becoming harder. They were more scrutinized by the banks, and they could block them, or they would decide to just close the banks of that remittance companies because they're sending X amount of flows to those countries. The issue when I started to consult this company and talk with others is that they didn't really understand why their bank accounts were closed. So they would get a vague answer by the banks of, well, your compliance may not be up to speed, or your apparel approach is too risky. But that did not give a clear understanding to these remittance companies why the flows, the payments to the developing countries were stopped or blocked, or even worse, why they would actually stop sending, they would stop providing them bank accounts. So this was it was like the first issue that we had to understand and somehow tackle. One is understanding why the banks would bank and de-risk these remittance companies, and the second would be, is there another way? Do we really need to use correspondent banking? That's meaning for the blockage of the payments, and could we use something else? So many companies would use back then and still use, but then it became more prominent, Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is not regulated and Bitcoin could be sent peer-to-peer, and correspondent banks wouldn't touch Bitcoin. So it was an alternative solution to the problem without necessarily understanding the problem, but companies would use that. Of course, if I go down to Bitcoin, I come from a risk management background, and I wouldn't feel in ease to send. Neither I would advise anyone sending Bitcoin, because it price volatility. So unless you are very careful on how you hedge the risk, the FX risk, it could be one could lose money. So I when I was playing the role of a consultant and trying to figure out what's going on, I wouldn't. People did use Bitcoin, but I wouldn't feel comfortable of consulting. So, yes, does that answer your question, Spencer?
Absolutely, thank you. I appreciate you sort of simplifying it for me. I don't know the financial sector very well.
I know, and it's always a challenge. So perhaps one of the I had entrepreneurs telling me, Chryssi, simplifying your proposition and the problem statement. And I was like, how? Because it's quite technical in the matter. But I do appreciate simplifying a proposition as much as possible, and is absolutely crucial for people to understand. I've tried to do so. I don't know if I have.
You did excellently. Yeah, absolutely excellently. Thank you. I really appreciate that.
These were perhaps some of the challenges, and actually it was quite interesting to figure out this jigsaw puzzle. I finally got to the meat of the issue after joining another association and talking to different members, and it became apparent that financial institutions will debank or de-risk companies, and these remittance companies in this case, because they were not commercially viable, and that if no matter how many flows you send cross-border, because each of these flows now, the compliance, one has to take action and understand, do some like compliance checks on these flows. That means costs and operational costs. And if you take the simple sum of the revenue of this transaction minus the compliance and operation costs, if it's at the end of the equation negative, then they wouldn't want to continue with this type of business, and they would just close that business segment down. And it was as simple as that, the main reason. But then, of course, what can you do in this case? How can you solve this problem? How you can help these remittance companies? The one way I thought one could do that is through compliance, transparency, and data sharing. So if one would share compliance checks and with another bank, or if this process would become more transparent, hopefully the operational costs would reduce. And if this process was digitized, then it would hopefully increase the uptake of remittance companies, bank them, and also support cross-border payments. So this was the logic of creating the way Starlix took its form. It was about more including compliance checks, embedding these checks into the payment information so that it's all in one. So as soon as a bank or whoever wanted more information about that payment, they could see the compliance checks were done, and that would minimize costs and would increase transparency, and it could support the communities to send cross-border payments. And that's how Starlix effectively was designed.
That sounds like an amazing journey. I really appreciate you sharing that. That just gives me such great insight into kind of your sector and your world. Similar to Spencer, I don't have a strong background in the financial sector, so really appreciate you walking through that. And really fascinating, right? I think it also kind of shows like the idea that we have to start with a problem that we've seen in the marketplace and dive as deep as we can into that and do due diligence to figure out, what actually is the problem, what's the root cause. And it sounds like, as you found, there was a lot more to it than you had initially thought, right? And that's part of that journey. And so I really appreciate that that you dove a bit deeper into that and kind of gave us some insight into it, because it's always easy to see kind of that linear journey of, wanted to start something, now successful in starting something, right? And so being able to kind of see the twists and turns that you took along the way is extremely helpful. I think one thing that I noticed throughout, and you kind of mentioned this, was just a fascination and interest in the financial sector, in banking, in money markets, and how kind of that all works. Do you know where that comes from? Like, was there a point where you just decided that that was something you were very interested in, and kind of how that came about? I think it's a really interesting area. but I personally don't know a ton about it, and I don't know that our audience is deep into the financial sector either. So I'd love to hear a little bit about what drove you towards that industry.
It was more about trying to understand how things work. So if I go back, I remember I was a junior structural engineer, so I took 1 year off when I was studying civil engineering, and I worked for a structural engineer company, and I was designing slabs, and and I was like, where the money comes from? I'm just designing something very square, and yes, I enjoy it, but how does it work? Who has financed it, and what's the bigger picture? And I had all these questions, and I'm like, well, this is interesting. I have absolutely no idea how the system works. Who finances, how the money flows, how we come, how we are, so how, why we're designing slabs, or why we're designing this building. And I was like, okay, I'd like to find more. Just, try to step out in the system and understand how things work and how things relate to each other. So I did a financial mathematics course, and then luck, timing, nobody can explain how things turn out in life. I ended up as my first job working for the regulator, and this is where I came about saying that it's important to understand the different actors in one's industry, so their point of view, how they see it. So when I was working for the regulator, we were visiting financial institutions with supervisors and asking questions, and their main interest is to regulate and make sure the financial institutions have certain capital against certain risks, and there are certain formulas to do so, and etc., and certain regulatory requirements. But do they really understand how a financial institution operates? And it's still a challenge, because they are chasing usually the industry. The industry always looks for new business models, new opportunities, and how to make money. And that's their main focus. And then the regulators are trying to understand what these financial institutions are doing, how they model these risks, or what are their products. So they're always trying to figure things out. And I was like, okay, this is interesting. And there is a more risk-averse culture in the regulator, in the people who work in this type of organization, like the regulators. So I was like, okay, I don't want to understand what they're regulating, who they're regulating. We're trying to understand these institutions, but unless you work in one, you understand them from a theoretical perspective. So I was like, okay, let me understand them from a practical perspective. And that's why I moved to a bank. And I worked for a bank in the risk management department. Then I was like, the risk managing all these products and services, what do they actually do? Because we just see numbers. When you see numbers, you may be very good in understanding some things, but you don't understand the source. You don't understand who is behind these numbers, or how these numbers are driven, like a volume of flows. Or I was like, okay, after working as a risk manager, I want to understand the business sector. So I worked for a business division where you come in contact directly with corporates, whom the financial institution will lend money or find different types of structures to facilitate credit. And then, of course, I was working with technology, and financial institutions have a lot of legacy. They're big, and they acquired technology and systems like 30 years ago, and it's just so hard to change because it's so embedded in the way they do things. And then you end up with like a big bank has different types of technologies, and some of them don't talk to each other, so they're completely in silos, and you have different numbers come from around with different areas. So I'm like, this is interesting. I must understand better technology and systems. So then I went to work for FIS, which was Sangard FIS, which was one of the biggest companies that provide all types of systems, from payment systems and risk management systems and treasury systems. And I was implementing systems, and then you see the background technology, and then you appreciate that yes, it's hard to change. Imagine big companies, how easy is it to change their infrastructure and technology? It's really hard. So then you see the dynamics of technology, like, for example, now technology, AI is just moving at such a fast pace, although AI existed many, many years ago, but now it's just evolving, and you see its applications everywhere. But how is it for these big financial institutions or tech firms, the big ones, to change or adapt their technology? Then that's part of when you hear change and digital transformation projects, which are hard. But this is more or less the reason why I took this journey. And while I was working on Starlix and trying to figure out Starlix, then trying to piece things together, and you have all these actors and more actors that I did not appreciate that came into the picture.
Thank you so much. That's such an interesting journey, how you went around the industry and went into different companies and saw it from all these different perspectives. I think that's such a smart way to get like a real deep understanding of how the whole system works. And I think that must have put you in very good stead for understanding the different perspectives and how to serve different needs in the industry. One thing we wanted to talk about was, obviously, congratulations on making the Women in Fintech Power list 3 years in a row. As a fintech entrepreneur, educator, and mentor, can you talk about your passion for advocating for financial inclusion and sustainable finance?
Yeah, thank you. So, financial, yes, I feel that it's important to support each other and be open and transfer knowledge. So over the past few years, that's what I've been doing. So I've been part of FCA sprints because I used to work for the FCA, for the regulator. I wanted to keep contact with them, and they opened up and they organized these tech sprints and challenges, which I like to participate and share my knowledge so far up to date with people, with other participants. So, for example, they have organized a few digital sandboxes so far, and these companies come in, but they haven't worked with regulators before. And I'm a mentor, and I try to give them the understanding of how a regulator thinks and the culture, and what other actors or they should consider when they plan their journey, and how other dynamics work between those actors. So this is some of the feedback and some of the insights that I provide to companies on these challenges, and I've been doing that the past 3 years or so. And I also felt that it's important to understand the application of some of the technology. So the past few years I've been experimenting. So, for example, I did a proof of concept with distributed ledger technology that was for FCA, for Starlix. Beforehand, while I was working for this early stage company called Calgera, we were looking on how to design frameworks to identify financial vulnerability by using different machine learning methodologies. During Starlix as well, had different data sets, and I had a data scientist looking on how to identify patterns of fraudulent profiles. Whether we could recognize them, because there were incidents where there was a pattern, or there were incidents where senders or beneficiaries of a payment would be fraudulent companies, and many people were defrauded. So I was interested in understanding how we could profile these parties. So experimented with other machine learning models with the data scientists and how you visualize them, and playing and testing and seeing how you can use these technologies in different use cases. You see what works, you see what doesn't work, you see the challenges, like many people trying to use AI, if they don't have big data sets, they use like real data sets. They try to get synthetic data. And what does that mean? And the challenges of that. So it's trying to take some problems within the industry of the financial services, and also test new technologies, and see what it works, what doesn't work, and you learn. There are many assumptions made. Recognize that the assumptions are made. Recognize that you have to codify and write these assumptions, because otherwise it can become very dangerous. So that's, you may hear for AI, biases and etc. So it was, I think, one of the reasons that perhaps I made it to the Fintech Power list was that I experimented, I just shared knowledge, I lectured a bit, I was on different webinars and podcasts, and just being open about the experiences and sharing them with others.
That's great. And I think, I don't know how this is, but I'd assume, I know you mentioned that a lot of the financial industry is very kind of traditional, and it seems like some of that could lead to some siloing, right? So being very closed off between institutions and not sharing knowledge, and gaps in knowledge thereof. And so it sounds like by kind of taking the opposite stance of, hey, I'm going to try things out and test and learn and share, you were able to actually kind of create some innovation within the space, right? And kind of find your own way throughout. So I think that's really neat to see that you saw this industry, you saw kind of the gaps and challenges, and were able to go, okay, well, I'm going to do this slightly differently. I'm going to see what works for me. I'm going to find those gaps and those challenges, and start to kind of piece those together, and bring people along, share my knowledge throughout, and share my knowledge along the way, to help kind of develop a better, I'll say, industry or pocket thereof. So I think that's really cool. And again, congratulations on making the Women in Fintech Power list for 3 years in a row. That's awesome. So congratulations there. One thing I know you mentioned a little bit, just some of the challenges that you had along the way. Was wondering if you could dive a little bit, whether that's specific to Starlix, or other areas that you've been in. But what are some of the challenges you encountered as you were moving through your journey and starting a company and trying to explore different facets of the industry, and eventually leaning into kind of decentralized, or centralized ledger payments rather than crypto, et cetera. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about just some of the challenges you faced as you were building and growing.
There were many challenges, which I actually include under the lessons learned. One of the most recent, one of the challenges is understanding the power dynamics of the different actors, which I don't know if I could say I underestimated, but through the journey I grew to appreciate. So I mentioned the regulator, which I felt the regulator plays a really big role. And for example, I felt that if the regulator cracks the whip, then people will move. Not necessarily. And one has to really understand the motives of the parties. So in the financial institution, in the financial industry, the main motive is money, by no surprise. And regardless how much they talk about financial inclusion and sustainability or sustainable finance, money is the key driver. The same I figured out is about compliance. So if, for example, compliance, I figured out, I understood it's a lot, people treat it a lot as a tick box. Although it's changing, and there are different companies who actually appreciate and do their best, there are a lot of other companies that do see it as a hassle and what we have got to do, which is absolutely necessary, and that's good enough mentality. So and I expect this would be the same for sustainable finance. But I will keep my attitude positive, because this is one of the next steps I want to get involved with. These are one of the challenges, is appreciating the drivers, and actually not assuming. Through my journey, I made some assumptions, and I thought I tested those assumptions. It would have been best if I tested them even further. Like, say you make 5 assumptions and you ask a question of why, what, and then you understand those assumptions are based on some other assumptions, and you have to dig even further. But you figure out that some of the assumptions are based on some other assumptions which you have not tested, but then the foundations are a bit risky. So it's good to, despite how hard it is to eliminate as much as possible all types of assumptions, and that includes those assumptions for the market, like numbers, how big the market is, or how much they are willing to pay, or how actually important it is for them. Because subjects ask compliance, in some cases it is important and it is driven by regulation. But if somebody says this is good enough, then obviously that doesn't make in the priority list or number one. So they get the budget ticked off for that. So these were some of the challenges that I encountered, along with technical challenges. There are many companies who, if you want to outsource your development, there are many companies who offer outsourcing, develop the solution MVP for you, and that needs someone inside to manage very well the outsourcing team. Again, people make several assumptions of how people work, and that could go pretty wrong. So being very upfront actually from the very start on numbers, how people work, how teams work, whether they have the budget, for example, for this project. Otherwise you waste your time. Or what is actually their priority, or what's their motives? And all these questions, they may be taught, or you may have come across, but next time I will appreciate them more.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's interesting. I didn't realize that there was sort of, well, I guess I also assumed that there was more power and push from the words that the regulator said than you said. It's quite an interesting aspect of it. And additionally, I'm quite curious about what you were saying earlier about a lot of technology in financial sectors being quite legacy technology. Do you feel that that's something that is sort of for the older, bigger financial companies, a place that they're missing out and that startups can jump into quickly because they can provide that newer technology utilizing, platforms or systems that aren't developed quite so far back?
Surely. So that's how the fintech landscape came to rise over the past few years. The banks had legacy technology, and also they were harder to move. So a lot of fintechs saw this opportunity, and they created the front facing. So the past 10 years has been all about customer journey and customer experience, and therefore the Monzos, the Revoluts, and all these N26 and so many other companies came into the space because they would provide a much easier and much more well-designed front-end facing tool where end users could log into a nice app, figure everything out, see their accounts, see how they can do their FX rates and use the card in other countries, and so much easier to use. Nevertheless, these front-end companies sit on banks. If they're not a bank, in some occasions they are a bank, but many of them are not banks, and they sit on a bank. And then you have got the legacy systems at the back end systems that move the payments or create the accounts and bank with central banks and move if you want to send money, for example, from here to India, how you do that. The money moves through the back-end systems and not the front-end systems. So there is a lot of still legacy back-end, which I think many of bigger financial institutions are trying to figure out and exploring technologies. I've not been working in a financial institutions, so I can see what's the challenges of these transformation projects. But and there are over the past few years there have been a few banks that actually have designed as back-end banks, and then they bank front-end fintechs that have customer facing. And this is also how the financial services have been restructured. So it's very much a layered approach. Not in all cases. You may have a bank, on top of a bank sits another bank in quotations, and in front of that it sits, for example, Revolut, or you see discussions, well, for people who are involved in financial services, like embedded finance. Now they're embedding financial services into Amazon or into Google or into other types of big tech companies. So it's becoming a much more it's a more complex system with different layers and building blocks building on top of each other.
Yeah, oh yeah, no, that was great. I mean, it sounds, extremely complex, right? I mean, and certainly some interesting areas of opportunity there, as you've said. But yeah, no, that was amazing. I loved the response there and talking through kind of the challenges you've seen and some issues that there have been. And then what's interesting to me is kind of how you mentioned with fintech, kind of the rise of, and how you've been able to see companies like Google, right, Apple, kind of integrating finance into their products and platform as a way to kind of create a full-fledged ecosystem, right? So being able to integrate it into their devices and into their platforms. So a really interesting space, really interesting kind of area there. I know we're coming up on time here, but wanted to just check in and make sure we had a few extra minutes of your time, Chryssi, for questions. So if you don't mind staying a few minutes over, would love to ask you a few more questions. Awesome. One question I have is really just as we've talked through the last 50 minutes here, talking about your journey, understanding a little bit more about finance, fintech, the challenges there within. What's next for you, right? What's next with you in Starlix, and where do you look to go next, or what areas of opportunity do you see that you want to explore? You had mentioned sustainable fintech, I believe, but would love to hear a little bit more about what your future plans are.
Yeah, sure. So one of my visions about Starlix was, I mentioned before, embedding compliance information into payments. And at some point, I wanted to take embedding additional data into transactional information, like more about environmental, or it's called ESG, but ESG is just environmental, social, and governance factors. So more environmental factors, because you have quite a lot of governance factors as part of compliance. So I wanted to move towards that direction. Now perhaps Starlix will take its own journey, but me as an individual would want to ideally move into sustainable finance. I feel it's very important to, as hard as it is, try to adapt the financial system or a few of these actors to behave differently and perceive things a bit differently on how they direct capital and how they manage capital. And given that I have usually a data-orientated view of I feel data is important to understand more about that transaction or the direction of flow of money, etc. I'm interested in how one can collect additional information and data around environmental factors and social factors, and include this into transactional information on how one can adapt the infrastructure around that. So this is my main interest. Of course, you never know how what happens through life and what life throws you and where it can direct you. But yes, so I think this would be important to somehow adapt the financial system for the next generation.
That sounds very exciting, and thank you so much for sharing that with us. Now, we do have one question that we do like to ask everyone that we have on, and I think we may have asked it to you already when you came on last time, but the question is, and we like to end with this, is what words of wisdom do you want to leave with us with today? This can be a favorite quote, someone else's advice that they gave you, or a lesson or takeaway from your journey so far. Feel free to interpret it in the way that makes the most sense to you.
Okay, so for the entrepreneurs, I had some mentoring done to me while I was running Starlix, and the advice I was given, which I found it's actually important for regardless if you're an entrepreneur or not, is make sure within your daily life you are able to push your business, do something about your health, do something about your family and social, and also nurture your spirituality. So keep basically yourself in balance, because it's hard to go off balance. So perhaps that's for the fellow entrepreneurs and anybody. It's very easy to be caught up in the rush of doing things, and then within that rush you may, under stress, you will not have clear mind, and it's important you maintain a clear mind. And by taking some breaks or be in touch with yourself and with what's important for you, is it keeps you not only alive, but it keeps you focused, and it keeps you in touch with what's important and why you're doing it in the first place. And the second piece of advice is, again, for entrepreneurs, which uh, I underestimated, so that's why it's in my mind, is understand your market and the numbers of the market. And if you find yourself that you're making assumptions which you feel that you want to persuade yourself that that's how it is, then that's a big risk. You will have to reassess everything.
I think that's great advice. I think both those points. One, I mean, first to touch on the first point, I think a lot of the times we lose sight of that, right? Is that balance, right? Being able to balance home, family, personal, professional life. And really sometimes, you start to, like you said, when that becomes out of balance, you start to lose sight of one or the other. And I think it's tough to regain some of that. And so, um, I think that's very sound advice. I think that's something that we all can kind of learn from. And your second point, I think, is also great advice. I think the idea of always be testing your assumptions, making sure you know your market, and not making assumptions on the market. I think it's very easy to assume you know a lot about the market because you may be a customer or you may be in that industry without taking the time to explore further. And so I think that's excellent advice. So thank you very much, Chryssi. We really appreciate you being here and sharing your thoughts, everything you've shared with us and taught us today. Really had a great time chatting with you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, everyone else who joined us today. We really appreciate you bringing your perspective and energy to the discussion. Spencer, myself, and the rest of the team behind Founders Voyage really feel fortunate to be a part of this community. We really love engaging with all of you, and thank you for the opportunity to bring this cooperative learning experience, and share that with you each week.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
So if there's any nominations for future guests, let us know. And so thank you, everyone. Thank you, Chryssi. Thank you, Spencer. And we'll see everybody next week.
Thank you so much, Chryssi.
Thank you, Spencer. Thank you all.
Have a lovely day, everyone.
Of course.
Thanks, guys.
You've just finished another episode of Founders Voyage, the podcast for entrepreneurs by entrepreneurs. The team at Founders Voyage wants to thank you from the bottom of our hearts. We hope you enjoyed your time with us, and if so, please share this with someone else who might enjoy this podcast. You can also support us by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and by donating to our Patreon. Outro music today is Something for Nothing by Reverend Peyton's Big Damn Band.